Thank you, as always, for tuning in. And I just want to thank our presenting sponsor, Sanofi, one more time. We could not do it without our partners there, and we are so grateful for the emphasis that you all put on educating the community. Okay, everybody, let's start with blood clotting. Now, think of it like this. Your blood has a big party to attend, and when there's an injury, the clotting system steps up to make sure that the blood doesn't spill anywhere. So, when you get a cut, your body kind of goes into emergency mode. It's like when the bouncers at the club have to step in and make sure that things don't get, too crazy. So these clotting factors come together to form a plug that seals the wound and helps prevent bleeding out. But here's the twist. Sometimes the party's a little too wild and the blood clots more than it should. And that is where anticoagulants come in. Imagine a party where the security guards, let's just call them anticoagulants, are making sure that the blood doesn't get too crazy and form clots where they shouldn't. So anticoagulants are like the chill security guards at the door, making sure that the clotting process doesn't get out of hand and cause problems. Let's hear more about this from Dr. Ben, who I'm sure are not going to call them security guards.
There's four main components of the anticoagulant system: protein C and protein S, antithrombin, and then TFPI, which stands for tissue factor pathway inhibitor. And all of those have been looked at, and all of those are being investigated to see how well they can rebalance the bleeding problems in hemophilia A or hemophilia B.
All right, now that we've met the heavy hitters of the anticoagulant squad, let's shift gears and talk about tissue factor, aka the behind-the-scenes troublemaker. It is the key player in the coagulation party, and when it shows up, things really start to heat up.
So tissue factor is part of the coagulation cascade. It's one of the procoagulant factors. It's called tissue factor because it's in tissue that's outside of the blood. And when it's exposed, it makes activated factor 7 start working. That activated factor 8 and factor 9 work together. Activated factor 7 and exposed tissue factor work together in very analogous ways.
Okay, buckle up, because now we're diving into the coagulation cascade. Picture this. Tissue factor, our secret agent, sneaks into the blood and calls in factor 7, like, hey, it's time to go. And when factor 7 gets the signal, it jumps into action and becomes activated. And here is where the fun begins. It teams up with the tissue factor like a dynamic duo, ready to rock the coagulation scene. Once activated, factor 7 brings in factor 10 to the party. And when factor 10 gets activated, it's like the ultimate chain reaction. Bam! We're on our way to forming a clot. It's like setting up a domino effect, with each factor triggering the next, and by the end, we've got a nice, solid clot to stop the bleeding. So yeah, tissue factor and factor 7 are like the bouncers at the club, letting the whole coagulation crew do their thing.
So that complex of tissue factor and active factor 7, that's the trigger that tells the coagulation cascade, you're outside of blood, there's tissue factor around, start working. And that's what then lets you generate indirectly a little bit of thrombin. And then once you generate a little bit of thrombin, and thrombin says, okay, I'm not being regulated, I'm going to feed back and make a lot of factor 8, activate factor 8, and a lot of activate factor 5, and I'm going to indirectly activate factor 9, and then we're going to make a whole bunch of thrombin, and we're going to stop this bleeding. There's also something called TFPI, which stands for tissue factor pathway inhibitor.
Now, imagine TFPI as the chill police of the clotting world. Once the clotting party is in full swing, TFPI steps in and is like, whoa, slow down there, party animals. And it puts the brakes on the entire cascade, making sure things don't get too wild or out of control. TFPI's job is to prevent excessive clotting, so we don't end up with the traffic jam of clots. It's all about keeping the balance. Too much clotting is just as bad as too little. Again, here's Dr. Ben.
And so even though the name sounds similar, it does the opposite thing. And so what it does is that initial pathway of when activated factor 7 and tissue factor start kicking off, it blocks that. And so it's one of those ways that the initial signaling trigger to start thrombin generation then is downregulated by TFPI. And I'm going to wave my hands a little bit because I think it's actually more complicated biologically, but one way to sort of simplistically think about how decreasing TFPI could be really helpful in when you don't have enough factor 8 and factor 9 is instead of turning off that initial signal of making thrombin, you leave it open because the amplification doesn't happen. So you just keep the initial signal open and make thrombin, where because of the low factor 8, factor 9, the amplification is not happening. And so that's one rationale why TFPI might be especially helpful in hemophilia A or hemophilia B.
And y'all, we are going to be right back after these messages.
#MyHemophiliaTruth. Real stories powered by Sanofi. It's time to consider the whole experience when it comes to managing hemophilia and change the conversation. Explore the full story at www.myhemophiliatruth.com.
All right, now we meet Antithrombin, the cool-headed bouncer at the clotting club. While the clotting party's raging, Antithrombin's just standing by the door, making sure no uninvited guests or, excess clotting factors are getting in. It's kind of like, hey, no need to get rowdy. We've got enough clots for now. You know what I'm saying? Antithrombin's all about keeping things in check, ensuring the blood doesn't turn into one big, sticky mess.
Antithrombin, historically, 30 years ago, we also called it antithrombin 3. You'll see that a lot. The current name, there's only one antithrombin currently. It inactivates a lot of activated coagulation factors. So I mentioned, it's really important that the whole coagulation cascade can be turned off eventually. One of the ways the coagulation cascade is turned off is by antithrombin inactivating activated factors. And it does this really well with thrombin and activated factor 10. Antithrombin can also inactivate, in certain scenarios, activated factor 7 and activated factor 9.
So antithrombin, this guy, is the ultimate clotting referee. And how exactly does it throw the flag and call foul on the coagulation game? So let's dive into the nitty-gritty of how antithrombin keeps everything in check, making sure the clotting chaos doesn't spiral out of control.
Another way that the clotting cascade is controlled in space is that the inactivation process is accelerated if the antithrombin interacts with heparins, which are often on healthy blood vessels. So you can imagine that if you start clotting where there's a healthy blood vessel, the potency, the strength of the antithrombin inhibition is stronger.
Okay, so antithrombin's got the game on lockdown, but what about all the other players in the coagulation crew? You've got your proteases, your cofactors, a whole cast of characters working together to keep the show running smoothly. Now let's bring in Dr. Patrick to break down how all these proteins work together in this coagulation dance-off. We're going to call it a dance-off.
Coagulation proteins are all these proteins, and there's different types. There's ones called proteases, which are kind of like scissors. They go around and, kind of cut things and do things, and they change other proteins. And then there's things that are called cofactors in the coagulation cascade. And there's all sorts of those proteins. And so for hemophilia, the ones we hear about the most are factor 8 and factor 9.
Okay, now balancing this whole coagulation system is like trying to keep your dance moves smooth. You don't want to go too fast or too slow. If we mess with it too much, we could end up with too much clotting or not enough. It's all about finding that sweet spot. So let's talk about why keeping things balanced is key and what can happen if we tip those scales a little bit too far.
There's a buddy I go running with who, when he was asking me what I do for a living, and I was talking about this research, and he's like, but how does the body stop that? Because you don't want it to just go forever, right? And I was like, wow, this is like better than most of the fellows and stuff that we get. And so there's a number of them there, and a lot of them are either just present in the plasma like antithrombin. There's just sort of a certain level. Tissue factor pathway inhibitor is another one that is just kind of always there constitutively ready to stop things, to put on the brakes.
Okay, here's another analogy for you. I like to think of natural anticoagulants kind of as party planners. They're great at keeping everything in check, making sure the dance floor is not too crowded or too empty. But if we push them into overdrive, like turning the music up a little bit too high, they might lose control of the vibe. And in hemophilia treatment, it's all about knowing when to adjust the volume just right. So too much of a good thing, and we risk turning the whole thing into a disaster. So it's all about finding that sweet spot where everything stays balanced and fun.
The way I think about it, maybe I'll answer a slightly different question, but hopefully it'll answer the one that you're asking. The way I think about this is anytime we start mucking around with the clotting system, we got to be really, really careful, right? So the system is this highly organized interaction of many different moving parts. And if we start to muck around in there and try to influence it one way or the other, we run the risk of tipping that balance too far one way or the other. So I think the complexity of it is that we're trying to modify or intervene in the way that a really complicated biological system works. And we're fools if we think we're smarter than Mother Nature. So, and I remember, when these new rebalancing agents were first being talked about.
So when we talk about adjusting these natural anticoagulants in hemophilia treatment, it's like managing a party guest list. You want the right mix of people to keep things lively, but what happens if you invite just one too many? Things could get quickly out of hand. And it's all about finding that perfect balance where everyone has a good time without the party getting too out of control. This balancing act mirrors what we've seen in clinical trials with clotting factors. And those trials have shown us how far we can go and what happens if we push the limits too much. Tell us what you think, Dr. Redding.
I think the complexity of it is just that. It's an already complex system, and we're trying to sort of like circumvent it or counteract it in a way. We worry about the potential consequences of getting it wrong. I will say in the clinical trial experience of these drugs being developed, we have learned some stuff. I mean, we did see some clotting events.
Mark lives with hemophilia A. Along with spending time with his wife and their twin daughters, he enjoys volunteering and cooking. What you don't know about Mark is the impact that living with hemophilia has on his daily life. Mark bravely shares how hemophilia has impacted his relationships. He emphasizes that shared decision-making with healthcare providers, along with strong family and caregiver support, is key to managing the challenges of hemophilia. Scan the QR code or click the link in the show notes to hear Mark's full story and learn more about how important shared decision-making is for hemophilia patients and their support system.
All right, we've been talking about ways to keep the clotting system in check, right? But what happens when things go a little too slow? What if the body's trying to stop clotting, but it just takes its sweet old time?
It's one of the natural anticoagulant proteins or one of the clot regulating proteins. So this one works in a different part of the clotting system. It doesn't target thrombin directly. It targets some stuff kind of upstream of that. And it's basically a protein that's kind of puts the brakes on clotting. So when your clotting system gets turned on, TFPI is one of the things that kind of regulates that and keeps it from being turned on too much. So I think about it as sort of like a brake. The problem if you're missing factor 8 or factor 9 is you don't have enough clotting system activity. And so even a normal amount of the braking action is too much. And so if you can just sort of ease up on the brakes a little bit, that clotting system that doesn't have enough factor 8 and factor 9 can still get the job done. So these newer medicines that target TFPI work by They're actually antibodies that bind to TFPI and inhibit its function. So they sort of like help take the foot off the brakes, so to speak, and restore balance that way.
What if we need a little extra push to get the system moving without tipping it too far? Well, that's where reducing antithrombin can come into play. By dialing down on antithrombin, we might be able to restore the clotting balance in hemophilia, giving us a bit more action without going overboard.
So antithrombin has a super cool name, antithrombin, right? It's like this very intimidating name. TFPI is not as intimidating. Antithrombin sounds like something you definitely want to pay attention to, right? So it does just what the name says. So remember how I said that one of the main goals of that clotting cascade is to generate this stuff called thrombin. Thrombin is this really important protein that kind of turns on a lot of the clot making things that make us clot. So antithrombin is sort of the antidote to thrombin. So it's a protein that neutralizes the function of thrombin and a handful of other clotting proteins, but thrombin is the main one. So it really is sort of like a direct counteractor of that thrombin that's generated when the clotting system gets turned on. So the way we're dealing with this in hemophilia to try to restore balance. So one of the new drugs that's being developed is a drug that decreases our liver's ability to make antithrombin. So it's a medicine that's given as a subcutaneous injection, and it sort of blocks the liver's synthesis or manufacturing process. So you make less antithrombin. So you have less of this clot regulating protein floating around in the blood. And if you take away just the right amount of that, it can restore balance. So even though you might be missing factor 8 or factor 9, instead of adding that stuff back to bring things back into balance, we take away some of the antithrombin and restore balance that way.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us today on Ask the Expert. We've had a blast breaking down anticoagulation therapy and how it keeps our clotting system balanced, like making sure our party guests stay in sync on the dance floor. While we've only scratched the surface, we hope the party analogy really helps you understand how all the different players, like our natural anticoagulants, work together to keep things running smoothly. I know it's a complex topic, but hopefully, with a little fun, it's a little bit clearer now. Did you know bloodstreammedia.com is your one-stop shop for all podcasts for the bleeding disorder and rare disease communities? There, you can find links to the Global Hemophilia Report and our flagship podcast, Bloodstream, with your hosts, me and Patrick James Lynch. You can also check out Flow, which is a show about straight talk about extreme periods, and The Pain Pod, which is an in-depth storytelling odyssey on chronic pain. All this and more on bloodstreammedia.com. If you have an idea for a future episode of Ask the Expert, or have a question that you would like to hear one of our experts answer, email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com, and you'll also find Bloodstream Media on Facebook and Twitter and on Instagram. You know, all those social media channels. I am your host, Amy Board, and until next time, stay curious, my friends.